You have a plan. Actually, you have 12 plans, one in a notebook from 6 months ago, one on your phone from last Tuesday, one inside your head that you keep rearranging every time something goes wrong. And somewhere underneath all of them is the quiet, exhausting suspicion that none of them are quite right. This is the modern trap, not laziness, not lack of ambition, not even lack of discipline. The trap is complexity dressed as wisdom. You keep adding more goals, more systems, more strategies, more self-improvement books, and somehow, the more you add, the further you feel from actually knowing what to do next. You are not failing because you don't have a plan. You are failing because you have too many competing plans and no single unshakable direction underneath all of them. There is a word in Japanese that the samurai used to describe a warrior with total strategic clarity, a man who could see the entire battlefield from inside a single breath. They did not call him the smartest man in the room. They did not call him the most educated. They called him Meikayo Shisui, a mind like still water reflecting the moon perfectly, not a mind full of strategies. A mind clear enough to see which single strategy was true, centuries before productivity systems, before morning routines went viral, before 5-year plan templates filled the internet. The samurai had already solved the problem of unclear living. They built a method so precise, so psychologically sound, that it didn't just help them win battles, it helped them build lives that meant something. And here is what nobody tells you about that method. It does not begin with a goal. It does not begin with a schedule. It begins with the removal of something you have been carrying so long you forgot it wasn't supposed to be there. What they removed, and how, is exactly what we are going to explore together. His name was Hiroshi. He was 23 years old, and by every visible measure, he was exceptional. His sword work was precise. His footwork was clean. When the other apprentices sparred, Hiroshi won. When the scrolls of strategy were laid out for study, Hiroshi understood them faster than anyone in the dojo. His master had once said quietly, to no one in particular, that the boy had the instincts of someone who had already lived 100 battles. And yet, every morning, Hiroshi woke before the sun and sat at the edge of his sleeping mat with his hands on his knees, staring at the wall, not meditating, not planning, just sitting in the particular stillness of someone who does not know which direction to face. He trained in swordsmanship because a samurai must be able to protect. He studied military strategy because a samurai must be able to think. He practiced calligraphy because a samurai must cultivate the mind beyond warfare. He read about governance, about medicine, about the tea ceremony and the philosophy of Zen. He was doing everything. And that was exactly the problem. Because when you are moving in every direction at once, you are not actually moving at all. You are just spinning. And spinning looks like effort from the outside. From the inside, it feels like slowly disappearing. At night, Hiroshi would sit by the small fire in his quarters and arrange his scrolls around him like pieces of a map he couldn't read. He would pick one up, study it intensely, feel a brief surge of purpose, and then remember the other scrolls waiting on the floor, and the surge would fade, and he would sit there, surrounded by the evidence of his own capability, feeling strangely hollow. His master, an older man named Daisuke, watched all of this. He watched it for 3 weeks without saying a word. He watched Hiroshi arrive first to the training ground and leave last. He watched him read by firelight until his eyes were red. He watched him win every sparring match with the smooth efficiency of someone who had trained the body well, and then retreat into himself the moment the match was over, as if victory left him no more certain than defeat. Daisuke never intervened, never offered guidance, never asked what was wrong. Some of the other apprentices whispered that the old master had simply lost interest in Hiroshi, that he had moved his attention elsewhere. But those who watched Daisuke more closely noticed something different. He was not ignoring Hiroshi. He was studying him, the way a craftsman studies a piece of wood before deciding where to make the first cut. He was waiting, not for Hiroshi to get better, not for Hiroshi to figure it out on his own. He was waiting for Hiroshi to get tired enough to stop pretending he already had the answer. Maybe you know this feeling. Not Hiroshi's world, not the dojo, not the scrolls, not the sword, but the feeling underneath it. The feeling of being genuinely capable and genuinely lost at the same time. The feeling of working hard and still not knowing, deep in your chest, whether any of it is pointing somewhere real. You have the tools, you have the intelligence, you have the desire, and still something underneath all of it feels like it hasn't been settled yet. Like the foundation is missing and everything you're building is slightly tilted, and you keep building anyway, hoping that more effort will somehow correct the angle. It won't, because effort without direction is not discipline. It is noise with good intentions. Hiroshi understood this intellectually. He could have written it in calligraphy and hung it on his wall. But understanding a truth and being freed by it are completely different things, and he was not yet free. Then, on the morning of the 22nd day, Daisuke appeared beside Hiroshi at the training ground before the others arrived. The air was cold. The sky was the pale gray of early dawn. Hiroshi was running forms alone, his movements exact and beautiful and somehow desperately sad. Daisuke watched him finish, then he asked one question. Not, what do you want to become? Not, what are your goals? Not, what is your plan? He asked. What are you willing to be governed by? Hiroshi stopped moving. The question hung in the cold morning air like smoke. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. He looked at his hands. He looked at the ground. And for the first time in 3 weeks of constant motion, Hiroshi was completely, utterly still, not because he was at peace, but because the question had reached somewhere inside him that none of his scrolls had ever touched. He didn't have an answer, and that, as it turned out, was the most important thing that had happened to him in years. Before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell me the one area of your life that feels most unclear right now. Not your biggest problem, just the area where the direction feels the haziest. You might be surprised how much clarity comes from simply naming it. Hiroshi thought about the question for the rest of that day. He thought about it while eating. He thought about it while cleaning his blade in the quiet of his quarters. He sat with it the way you sit with a splinter you cannot quite reach, aware of it constantly, unable to ignore it, unsure how to remove it. That evening, he returned to Daisuke. He had prepared an answer. I want to be governed by excellence, he said, by the pursuit of mastery in all things. Daisuke looked at him without expression. That is not an answer, the old man said. That is a wish dressed as a principle. Hiroshi tried again the following morning. Honor, he said. I want to be governed by honor. Daisuke considered this for a moment longer than the first answer. Then he shook his head gently. Honor is a result, he said, not a foundation. A man who says he is governed by honor has not yet asked what he is willing to sacrifice to keep it. Hiroshi spent 2 more days thinking, and on the 3rd attempt, he said something quieter, less certain, less polished than the first 2 answers, and Daisuke's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not approval exactly, but recognition, the recognition of a man watching someone begin to arrive at something real. But we are not yet at that answer, because before Hiroshi could find it, he had to understand something about the nature of clarity itself. And that understanding began not in the dojo, not in the scrolls, but at the edge of a river at the southern end of the village. Daisuke gave Hiroshi a single instruction that morning: no training, no reading, no strategy. Go to the river. He said, sit there from sunrise to sunset. Watch it, do nothing else. Hiroshi wanted to ask why. He had the discipline not to. He went. The river was wide and unhurried, moving between low banks lined with cedar and stone. Hiroshi sat on a large, flat rock at the water's edge, his hands in his lap, his back straight out of habit, and he watched. For the first hour he was restless. His mind kept reaching for things to analyze, to plan, to solve. The river just moved. It didn't seem to be teaching him anything. It seemed, if he was honest, like a waste of a day by mid-morning. The restlessness had quieted slightly, the way a disturbed pond gradually settles. He noticed the way the water moved differently around the large stones, not fighting them, not stopping, simply finding the shape that worked and moving through it. He noticed how the river had no map, no deliberate strategy, no visible effort, and yet it was going somewhere clearly, inevitably, without hesitation. By afternoon, something had begun to shift in his chest. By evening, he understood something he could not yet put into words. He walked back to the dojo slowly, in the long orange light of late afternoon, turning the feeling over carefully, the way you carry something fragile. He stood before Daisuke. He was certain he had understood the lesson. He told the master what he had seen. He explained the water's movement, its naturalness, its lack of force. He spoke about Shizen, naturalness, and how a life plan built on principle rather than desire would move the same way, flowing around obstacles without losing direction. He was proud of the observation. It was accurate, it was poetic. It was exactly the kind of answer a learned apprentice would give. Daisuke listened to all of it. Then he asked, "And what were the banks made of?" Hiroshi paused. He had not thought about the banks. He had watched the water. He had studied its movement. He had understood its naturalness. But he had not asked what was keeping it true. What invisible structure held the river to its course and prevented it from spreading thin across the earth and becoming a swamp? The banks. Without them, the river had no direction. The water's naturalness was not enough on its own. The naturalness had to be held, shaped, given something to move inside of. Hiroshi stood very still. He had been so focused on how to move that he had never asked what was supposed to hold him to his course. "The water is your energy," Daisuke said quietly. "Your effort, your ability. The banks are your governing principle. Without them, even the most powerful river becomes shallow and lost." He turned and walked inside, and Hiroshi stood in the dying light, understanding for the first time the precise nature of his own emptiness, not a lack of water, but a lack of banks. This is the structure the samurai built their lives inside, not a strategy, not a system, an architecture. And it had 3 layers that worked in a specific order, an order that almost no one gets right today. The first layer was the ocean, not the river itself, but the destination the river was always moving toward. In samurai philosophy, this was the vision, not a goal, not a target, a direction so large and so honest that it could never be fully achieved, but could always be moved toward. The kind of direction that makes every small daily decision feel meaningful, because every small daily decision is connected to something that actually matters. The second layer was the banks, the governing principle, the single value a warrior was willing to organize every choice around, not a list of values. 1. Because a man with 10 governing principles has none. A principle only governs when it is strong enough to cost you something, when you would give something up to protect it. That is how you know it is real. The third layer was the current, the daily action that moves naturally from the first 2 layers, not a to-do list, not a productivity system, simply the next honest step available, taken without overthinking, because the direction and the principle have already made the decision obvious. Most people today live entirely inside the third layer and wonder why nothing holds. They optimize their mornings, they build habits, they read about focus and deep work and quarterly goals. They move efficiently, but toward what? Held by what? They are fast, purposeful currents with no banks and no ocean, spreading wider and shallower every year, moving quickly toward nowhere in particular. Hiroshi had been doing exactly this. And here is the harder question, the one that stays with you after the metaphor settles. What is your ocean? Not the career you think you should want, not the version of success someone else modeled for you. The actual, honest direction you feel in your chest when everything else goes quiet. The thing you would move toward even if no one was watching. And what are your banks? Not your values in theory. Values in theory are decorations. What is the one thing you are actually willing to be governed by? The one principle you would sacrifice something real to protect. If you cannot answer those 2 questions cleanly and quickly, you are building the third layer on air. Hiroshi could not answer them yet either, but he was for the first time asking the right questions, And the right questions have a way of doing something uncomfortable to a person. They reveal the enemy, not an outside enemy, not circumstances, not bad luck or lack of resources or difficult people, the enemy inside the war room. Hiroshi woke the next morning and tried to sit with the river's lesson. He tried to feel for his ocean to locate his banks. He sat quietly, searching inward with the same focused attention he gave to sword practice. And immediately, the noise began. What if I choose the wrong principle? What if my ocean is smaller than I think? What if I commit to a direction and discover later it was the wrong one? What if I am not the kind of person capable of this kind of clarity? Question after question. Each one dressed as reasonable caution. Each one wearing the face of wisdom while doing the work of fear. By mid-morning, Hiroshi had not moved, not physically. He was sitting exactly where he had started. But internally he had traveled a great distance, backward, into doubt, into comparison, into a tangled argument with himself that had no end and no winner. This is what the samurai called the second arrow. The first arrow is the obstacle, the wound, the uncertainty, the genuine difficulty of not yet knowing your direction. That arrow is real, it lands, it hurts. You cannot always prevent it. But the second arrow is the one you fire yourself. It is the self-criticism, the catastrophizing, the comparison to people who seem more certain. The decision to make the confusion means something terrible about you as a person. The first arrow wounds you. The second arrow keeps you on the ground. Hiroshi had been hit by the first arrow. He genuinely didn't know his governing principle yet. That was real and honest and appropriate for where he was in his development. But every second arrow he fired made the wound worse. Every "what if I choose wrong" turned a temporary uncertainty into a permanent identity. I am the kind of person who doesn't know. And once that becomes your identity, not knowing begins to feel safe, familiar, even, and clarity begins to feel dangerous. Because clarity requires commitment, and commitment means you might be wrong, and being wrong, to someone who has built their identity around being thoughtful and careful and thorough. That is the thing that cannot be tolerated. So instead of committing, you research, you plan more, you add another system, you read another book. The second arrow lands again. That evening, Hiroshi did something he had never done before. He went to Daisuke not with an answer, not with a polished observation, but with the truth. I cannot find it, he said. Every time I reach for it, I argue myself out of it before I can hold it. His voice was quieter than usual. There was no performance in it. Daisuke looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something Hiroshi did not expect. Good, the old man said. Now you know what was in the way. He paused. A warrior who does not know his enemy cannot defeat him. You have now met yours. He lives inside your own reasoning. He speaks in questions. He calls himself caution. And he has been costing you more than any opponent on a training ground ever could. Hiroshi felt something release in his chest, not dramatically, quietly, like a knot that had been there so long he had stopped noticing the tension. The second arrow, Daisuke said, is always optional. He went inside and returned a moment later with a small sheet of paper and a brush. Write 3 things, he said. Only 3, take as long as you need, but nothing more than 3. He set the paper on the table and left Hiroshi alone. Hiroshi sat with the brush in his hand for a long time. He was tempted to write a list. He was tempted to outline. He was tempted to draft and revise. But the instruction was clear, and he had learned enough now to understand that the temptation to add more was itself the problem, not the solution. He wrote slowly, the one thing I am willing to serve, the direction that serving it points me toward, the one action available to me today. Just 3 strokes of the brush, clean, simple, almost painfully plain after weeks of complexity. But when he read them back, something happened that he hadn't expected. They were true, not impressive, not comprehensive, not perfectly optimized. Just true. The way a single clear note from a flute is true in a way that 1,000 competing instruments are not. He brought the paper to Daisuke. The master read it. He did not speak immediately. He held the paper and looked at it the way a man looks at something he recognizes from a long time ago. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in Hiroshi's hand. "Keep it," he said. "Not on a wall, not in a frame, in your sleeve, where you will feel it when you reach for your blade." He said nothing else, but the silence that followed felt entirely different from the silences that had come before. This one was not empty. It was full. The way a room feels after something important has just been decided. This is the method, not complicated, not expensive, not requiring a weekend retreat or a productivity application or a complete life overhaul. 3 strokes. The first stroke is your governing principle. The single value you have decided is worth organizing your life around. Not 5 values, 1. The one you would not abandon even when it costs you something. For Hiroshi, after all of it, it was simple to make myself worthy of what I protect, not glory, not mastery as an abstract achievement, a living, daily commitment to deserving the responsibility he carried. The second stroke is your honest direction, where that principle, followed faithfully, actually points you, not where you think you should go, where it goes when you follow it without interference. For Hiroshi, it pointed not toward fame as a warrior but toward becoming a teacher, someone who passed the clarity on the river finding its ocean. The third stroke is today's action, not this year's plan, not this month's goal, the single honest, available action that moves you one step in the right direction, nothing more. Because one true step taken is worth more than 10 optimized steps planned and never taken. You can do this right now. You don't need a retreat. You don't need to have it perfectly figured out. You need a pen, piece of paper, and the willingness to write something true instead of something impressive. What are you willing to serve? Where does serving it actually point you? What is the one action available to you today? 3 strokes. That is the entire method. Its simplicity will tempt you to dismiss it. That temptation is the second arrow. Let it pass. Months went by. Hiroshi lived by the 3 strokes, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but honestly. And what he discovered was that the method did not make life easier exactly. It made life clearer, and clarity, it turns out, is a form of rest that no amount of sleep can provide. There were mornings when someone would offer him an opportunity that sounded attractive, a prestigious post, chance for recognition, path that would have impressed the people around him. He would reach into his sleeve. He would feel the paper. He would ask, "Does this serve what I said I was willing to serve?" Sometimes the answer was yes. He took those opportunities without hesitation. Sometimes the answer was no. He declined without explanation, without apology, without the long internal argument that used to follow every decision. The second arrow still came, sometimes. Old habits are patient. But now he could see it for what it was, a question pretending to be wisdom, and he could choose not to pick it up. There were harder days too. A friendship that frayed when he chose his principle over comfort. A period of months where his chosen direction showed no visible progress, and he had to trust the river even when the ocean felt impossibly far. A morning where everything in him wanted to unfold a fresh scroll and start a new plan, something bigger, more comprehensive, more certain. He would reach into his sleeve, 3 strokes, still true. He kept moving. Years passed the way years do when a person is actually living them, not watching them accumulate, but spending them on something real. And one morning, when the light was the same pale gray of early dawn that it had been on the morning, Daisuke first asked him the question. Hiroshi sat in the position his old master used to occupy. The dojo was quiet. The training ground was empty. A young apprentice appeared at the edge of the courtyard. He was talented. Anyone could see it. His movements were clean. His eyes were sharp. He had already, at his age, read more scrolls than most men twice his years. He was also completely, quietly lost. Hiroshi recognized him the way you recognize a reflection. He watched him for a moment. Then he walked out into the cool morning air and stood beside him. The young man looked up, uncertain whether to speak. Hiroshi let the silence hold for a moment. Then, simply, clearly, he asked, "What are you willing to be governed by?" The young man opened his mouth, closed it, looked at his hands. And Hiroshi almost smiled, because that pause, that sudden, honest, slightly terrifying not knowing, was not a failure, it was the beginning. This is where clarity has always started. Not in the perfect plan, not in the right system or the optimized schedule or the comprehensive strategy. It starts in the willingness to ask one honest question and sit with it long enough to hear a real answer. The samurai did not master their lives because they were brilliant planners. They mastered their lives because they were honest enough to find the one thing worth planning around, and disciplined enough to let that one thing make their decisions for them. A clear life is not a complicated life. It is a governed life. One principle, one direction, one honest step at a time. The river knows where it is going because the banks hold it true. The water doesn't need to figure out the ocean. It just needs to move in the right direction and trust the architecture beneath it. You already have the water. You already have the energy, the ability, the desire to move. The only question is whether you are willing to build the banks, 3 strokes. That is all it takes to begin. If this way of thinking landed somewhere real for you, share it with someone who's been carrying too many plans and not enough direction. And if you want to go deeper into the kind of clarity the samurai built their entire lives around, the next video is already waiting for you.